Glenn Loury.
Forgive me, you guys, for sitting. I've got a back issue, and it's serious, so I can't stand at the podium for an extended period of time.
Is this working?
I don't know. Is it working? Everybody hear me? What an introduction. Thank you, Jim. What a gathering. I must tell you, I'm inspired by what I see here. There's a movement brewing. Somebody's fighting back. People are getting organized. Resources are being marshaled. And it's a fight worth having because the stakes are enormously high, in my opinion. We're fighting for our civilization here. We're fighting for the maintenance of standards. We're fighting for the protection of our values. So I am happy to be among you. Now, my topic, thank you. Very, very happy to be among you. Y'all are my people. I heard so much that I agree with here this afternoon, this evening, that, as I say, I'm inspired. My topic is race and inequality. It is a sensitive topic. I have a script, and I'm going to stick to it. It's crafted to say what I want to say and not to say anything that I don't want to say. And since I'm being recorded, and since it is a very sensitive topic, I'm at the University of Virginia, the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. I'm talking about my country and this great issue that confronts us. So I want to be careful, so forgive me if I share with you a text that I've prepared before. A specter haunts the domestic political landscape in America today. It is the specter of racial conflict, growing out of the anger and alienation of too many Black Americans. We all saw what happened in 2020. It was not a good thing for our country. The pundits tell us that we're living in a period of racial reckoning in America. Racial dispute suffuses our public life, from school committee elections to national political contests. This estrangement of Black intellectuals, politicians, journalists, and activists derives in turn from the fact of persisting Black disadvantage across so many fronts in our country's economic and social life. The reality here is too familiar, too widely known to require elaborate recitation. Whether talking about health or wealth, education or income, imprisonment or criminal victimization, the relatively disadvantaged status of those Americans who descend from slaves here in the third decade of the 21st century, more than 150 years after the emancipation, is palpable. What are we to make of this? That question has bedeviled me for decades. Indeed, ever since I began graduate studies in economics at MIT a half century ago. So it is with heavy heart that I stand before you this evening, a Black American economist in this era of racial discontent in my country, an Ivy League professor and a descendant of slaves, a beneficiary of a civil rights revolution, now more than two generations in the past, which has made possible for me a life that my ancestors could only have dreamed of. More than that, I'm a patriot who loves his country. I am a man of the West, an inheritor of its great traditions. As such, I feel compelled to represent the interests of my people here, now. But that reference is not unambiguous, invoking as it does both communal and civic antecedents. So then, what are my responsibilities right here and right now? I declare for all the world to hear that no matter the political turmoil that may envelop us, and regardless of my racial or ethnic identification, my fundamental responsibility is to stay in touch with reality and to insist that others do as well. As the great Thomas Sowell once put it, given a choice between rhetoric and reality, we are always best served to eschew the former and to embrace the latter. That's what I'm about this evening. That, I believe, is what this historic moment requires of all of us. The future of our democratic experiment is at stake. We Americans of all stripes have a great deal in common. Those commonalities can and should be the means of building bridges undergirded by patriotism between us blacks and the nation as a whole. At bottom, we all want the same things: a legitimate shot at achieving the American dream where each generation can do better than the one that came before. We all want to feel secure in our persons and our property. We all want clean and orderly communities with good services. We want a government that works for us and not the other way around. We want fair and equal treatment in the broader society and by our institutions. Connections between various groups in America could be stronger if we focus more on the things that we have in common instead of the things that divide us. And left to their own devices, that is what Americans of all races would be inclined to pursue. However, there are those among us who make a living by focusing on our differences, by claiming that there's something fundamentally wrong with America. These people are in error, and their grave error threatens to tear us apart. They must be opposed forthrightly, and I intend to do so in these brief remarks. It is far too easy to overstate our problems and to understate what has been achieved. The right idea, I maintain, for Black Americans and for the country at large is, in the conduct of our public business, to emphasize our common American interest and to de-emphasize our superficial racial differences. Racial disparities are real, of course, but inequality in America is not solely or even mainly a racial issue. There are many poor and marginalized white people. They deserve our concern too. The rate of interracial marriages has grown dramatically. An increasing number of people view themselves as multiracial, including the first Black president and vice president of this country. We talk constantly about racial identity, but seldom about culture or values. Don't those things transcend race? So, how are we to understand the alienation afflicting so many prosperous Black Americans? I believe this is the result of the false narratives being promulgated by demagogues and ideologues. Narratives about how something called white supremacy threatens them, about how we have, in effect, reverted to the era of Jim Crow, about how the country allegedly has its metaphorical knee on our Black necks, about how racist cops are supposedly hunting us in the streets such that it has become open season on Black people. Facts seem insufficient to stop these false narratives. My work seeks to rebut these departures from reality, in part just by looking at what has happened over the last 75 years. A Black middle class has emerged. There are Black billionaires. Our influence on American culture, Black people's, is stunning and has worldwide resonance. In fact, when viewed in global comparative perspective, we Black Americans are rich and powerful, with, for example, 10 times the per capita income of a typical Nigerian. The cultural barons and elites of America, the people who run the mainstream media, who give out literary prizes and foundation grants, who run the human resource departments of corporate America, who run the universities and the movie studios, these powerful people have all signed on as allies with blacks in our struggle for racial justice. They have bought into the woke racial sensibility hook, line, and sinker, all of which disproves the premise that the American dream does not apply to black people. To say so is to tell our children a lie about their country. It is a crippling lie which, when taken as gospel, robs us black people of our agency and a sense of control over our fate. And it is a patronizing lie that betrays profound doubt about the abilities of us black Americans to face up to the responsibilities and to bear the burdens of our freedom. For this is the existential challenge we black Americans now face in the 21st century. Not to throw off the shackles of our supposed oppression, but rather to take up the burdens of our freedom. As such, it is time to clear the air and, in a spirit of love for my people, to tell some unpalatable truths. So brace yourselves. Here's my fundamental claim. Bearing the burdens of black freedom in America today means accepting the fact that socially mediated behavioral issues lie at the root of today's racial inequality problem. These behavioral issues are real and must be faced squarely to grasp why racial disparities persist. Now, these are American problems, not merely matters of communal concern to black people. Nevertheless, downplaying these behavioral problems is a bluff. Activists on the left claim something called white supremacy, implicit bias, and old-fashioned anti-black hatred are sufficient to account for black disadvantage. While making such arguments, they are in effect daring you to disagree with them. You must be a racist, they say, one who thinks something is intrinsically wrong with black people if you fail to attribute pathological behaviors to systemic injustice. You must think blacks are inferior, for how else could you explain the disparities? That's what Ibram X. Kendi argues. Calling their bluff risks being convicted of the offense of blaming the victim. But this is a dare. It's a debater's trick. For instance, at the end of the day, what are those folks saying when they declare that something called mass incarceration is racism? That the high number of blacks in prison is self-evidently a sign of racial antipathy. Here's what they're saying. They're daring you to respond, no, it's mainly a sign of antisocial behavior by criminals who happen to be black. To respond in that way is to risk being dismissed as a moral reprobate. This is so even if the speaker is black. Just ask Justice Clarence Thomas. Nobody wants to be canceled, but we should all want to stay in touch with reality. Overwhelming evidence suggests that those in prison are mainly people who have hurt someone, who have stolen something, or have otherwise violated the basic behavioral norms that make civil society possible. The violent criminals taking lives on the mean streets of St. Louis, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago are, to a person, behaving despicably. Any ideology that ascribes this violent behavior to racism is simply not credible. But then, why have so many been getting away with espousing it for so long? Neither could any sensible person believe that 70% of African American babies being born to a woman without a husband is either a good thing or is due to anti-black racism. People say this, but they don't believe it. They're bluffing. They're daring you to observe this reality, that the 21st century failures of many African Americans to take full advantage of the opportunities created by the 20th century's revolution of civil rights These failures are palpable and damning. These failures are being denied at every turn, but that position, I maintain, is not tenable. The end of Jim Crow segregation and the advent of the era of equal rights for blacks were transformative historical events for this country. And now, a half century down the line, we still have significant disparities. This is, I acknowledge, a shameful blight on American society, but the fact of the matter is that a considerable responsibility for this sorry state of affairs lies with black people ourselves. Dare we Americans acknowledge this? More importantly, dare we black Americans accept our share of responsibility for it? Why, the success of the civil rights movement notwithstanding, the unequal status of black Americans has persisted into the 21st century is a profound question. Clear thinking about this problem, I maintain, requires us to distinguish between the role played by anti-black discrimination, past and present, and the role of behavioral patterns to be found among some blacks. Now, I admit, as I said at the outset, that this is a very sensitive issue, and I have framed it rather starkly. I acknowledge, for the record, that anti-black biases exist and should be remedied. But I am also urging that we blacks identify and seek to reverse the behavioral patterns that prevent some of our people from seizing newly opened opportunities. In recent writings, I have framed these two positions as causal narratives. Under what I call the bias narrative, one argues that the cause of persisting disparity by race is anti-black racism and that we must continue to reform American society toward achieving a level playing field. The focus there is on the demand side of the labor market, I say as an economist. I hope that such reform, now well advanced, is indeed necessary but not sufficient. By contrast, what I call the development narrative emphasizes the need to consider how people acquire the skills, traits, habits, and orientations that foster their successful participation in American society. Here, the focus is on the supply side of the labor market. Youngsters without those experiences, who are not exposed to the influences and who lack access to the resources that foster and facilitate their human development, those youngsters will fail to achieve their full human potential. These two narratives are not mutually exclusive, but in terms of prescribing intervention and remedy, they point in very different directions. I favor the development narrative over the bias narrative. This tension between a focus on the demand and the supply side factors in accounting for the persistence of racial disparities is a very old theme for me, dating back to my doctoral thesis at MIT in the 1970s, where I contrasted the concept that I called social capital with the more familiar economic idea of human capital. My fundamental point was to distinguish the logic of economic transactions from the logic of human relations, especially when trying to explain persistent racial disparity. Business investments are transactional, but human investments are essentially relational. As I saw it, the conventional economic theory was incomplete when it comes to explaining racial disparities, and there were two aspects of that incompleteness, one having to do with human development, as I have hinted, and the other with racial identity. Permit me to explain further. My first observation was that all human development is socially situated and mediated. That is, the development of human beings occurs inside of social institutions. It takes place as between people by way of human interaction. The family, the community, the school, the peer group. These cultural institutions of human association are where human development is achieved. Resources essential to human development. Thank you. Resources that are essential to human development, the attention that a parent gives to her child, for instance, are not alienable. Most developmental resources are not commodities. The development of human beings is not up for sale. Rather, structured connections between individuals create the context within which human developmental resources come to be allocated to individual persons. Opportunity travels along the synapses of these social networks. Precisely because people are not machines, their productivity, which is to say, the behavioral and cognitive capacities that bear on their social and economic functioning, are not merely the consequence of a mechanical infusion of material resources. Rather, these capacities are mainly the byproducts of social processes that are mediated by networks of human affiliation and connectivity. This was fundamentally important, I thought, and still think, for understanding persistent racial disparities in America. That was the first point I wanted to make all those years ago about the incompleteness of human capital theory. My second observation was that what we call race in America is mainly a social and only indirectly a biological phenomenon. Persisting racial differentiation across generations between large groups of people in an open society where individuals live cheek by jowl is irrefutable indirect evidence of a profound separation between the racially defined networks of social affiliation within that society. Over time, race would cease to exist in a society unless people chose to act in a manner so as biologically to reproduce the variety of phenotypic expression that constitutes the substance of racial distinction. I cannot overemphasize this point. We speak so casually nowadays about race, racial equality, racial justice, and yet race is not simply given in nature. It's socially produced. It's an equilibrium outcome. It's something that we're making. It's endogenous. It follows that if one is to understand the roots of durable racial inequalities in any society, then one will need to attend in some detail to the processes that cause race to persist as a fact in that society, because almost certainly such processes will not be unrelated to the allocation of human developmental resources in that society. I concluded from these two observations that we economists should recognize the limits of our tools to explain persistent disparities by race, because the creation and reproduction of racial inequality ultimately rest on cultural conceptions about identity that people embrace, blacks and whites alike. These are the convictions that people affirm about the legitimacy of conducting intimate social relations with racially distinct others. And here I do not only mean sexual relations. Racial inequality is inescapably a cultural phenomenon, I claim, implicating not only the transfer of resources, but more fundamentally, the decisions that we make daily about with whom to associate and with whom to identify. My contrast between human and social capital reflects my conviction that beliefs of this kind ultimately determine the access that people enjoy to the informal and non-fungible resources needed to develop their human potential. What I was calling social capital when I coined that term in 1976 is, on this view, a critical prerequisite for the production of human capital. And we economists know all too well that this human capital, that is, the skills, education, work experience, and social aptitudes individuals possess, determines a person's earnings and his or her capacity to generate and to accumulate wealth. The narrative we Black Americans settle upon emphasizing bias or development, looking to their politics or to our culture, seeking to combat anti-Black racism or striving to rebuild the Black family, embracing victimization or accepting responsibility. That choice is crucial. What is more, this choice of narrative governs how we Black Americans view our place within this great republic, the United States of America. This is worth arguing about. Is this a good country? One that affords boundless opportunity to all who are fortunate enough to enjoy the privileges and to bear the responsibilities of American citizenship? Or, as latter-day historical revisionists would have it, is this a venal, rapacious, bandit society full of plundering racists, founded in genocide and slavery, propelled by capitalist greed and unrepentant anti-Black antipathy? I regret to report that this latter narrative is being foisted on our young people in schools and universities across this land, and yet the weight of the evidence overwhelmingly favors the former. The founding of the United States of America, I'm here in Charlottesville, the founding of this great country was a world historic event by means of which Enlightenment ideals about the rights and the dignity of persons and the legitimacy of state power came to be instantiated in real institutions that have survived for centuries. True enough, the founding entailed a compromise with slavery. I'm aware of that. And yet now, some 40 million strong, we Black Americans have become by far the richest and most powerful large population of African descent on the planet. The question then is this: are we Blacks going to look through the dark lens of the United States as a racist, genocidal, white supremacist, illegitimate force? Or are we going to see our nation, for what it has become over the course of these last 3 centuries, which is the greatest force for human liberty in the history of the world? That's right, this is America. That's right, Thomas Jefferson's legacy. I wish fervently to urge the latter course. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. well understood, that is the surest pathway for us Black Americans to enjoy economic and political equality. The Civil War. 600,000 dead in a country of 30 million. The consequences of that war, together with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution enacted just afterwards, was to make the enslaved Africans and their descendants into citizens. In the fullness of time, we have become equal citizens. That should not have taken another 100 years, nor should my ancestors have been enslaved in the first place. But here's the thing. Slavery was a commonplace human practice dating to antiquity. Emancipation is what's new. The freeing of 4 million enslaved persons as a result of a massed movement for abolition and a horrible, bloody conflict, that was a new idea. It was a Western idea. It was an American idea. It was the fruit of Enlightenment philosophy and Christian charity. It was an idea brought to fruition over a century and a half ago in our own United States of America with the liberation of an enslaved people. Such an achievement would not have been possible without philosophical insights and moral commitments cultivated in the 17th and 18th centuries in the West. Ideas about the essential dignity and the God-given rights of all human persons. That is, America's founding at the end of the 18th century brought something new into the world. Slavery was a Holocaust in America, out of which emerged an accomplishment that advanced the morality and the dignity of humankind, namely emancipation. The ultimate incorporation of African-descended people fully into the American body politic has been a monumental, unprecedented achievement for human freedom. To whom much is given, of him much shall be required. I conclude. Freedom is one thing. Equality, quite another. The former is necessary but not sufficient for the latter. Here then is my final truth. It is both futile and dangerous for us Black Americans to rely on others to shoulder our communal responsibilities. If we want to walk with dignity, to enjoy equal standing within this diverse, prosperous, and dynamic society, then we must accept the fact that white America can never give us what we seek in response to our protests and remonstrations. Rather, we must earn equal status by dint of our own efforts. I take no pleasure in saying this, but I feel obliged to report this reality. Equality of dignity, equality of standing, of honor, of security in one's position within society, and equal ability to command the respect of others, such things cannot simply be handed over. They will not be the fruit of insurrection, violent uprising, or rebellion. Equality of this sort is something that we Blacks must wrest with our bare hands from a cruel and indifferent world by means of our own effort. Inspired by the example of our enslaved and newly freed ancestors, we must make ourselves equal. No one can do that for us. My fear is that until we Americans, all of us, recognize and accept this inexorable fact about the human condition, until we eschew the rhetoric and embrace the reality about race in our country, until then, the disparities that have so troubled our politics and that so threaten our domestic tranquility will continue to persist. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Time for a couple questions.
Sure.
If anyone has any questions, I think we have students walking around with microphones. Anybody? Okay.
Sir, Bob Morris, I represent the group from VMI. The first thing I want to tell you is, from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate your use of the 7 capital forms, social capital and the others. There's very few people who understand that. And I would just ask you, do you think that the use of social capital, human capital, and the others of the 7 capital forms are a good lens to look through in order to evaluate and respond to this DEI concept that's out there as a rational response?
Yes, is the short answer. I haven't thought about it deeply. I haven't actually, I mean, it's a challenging proposition to link the argument that I just was kind of making about the social foundation for the development of human beings to the larger DEI portfolio. But yeah, I do. I mean, you can tell from the tone of my remarks that I think the issues are on the supply side. The issues are about how do young people come to acquire those capacities that allow them to function effectively in adulthood. And I think the structural arguments are on the demand side. I mean, they're about people who are presumed already to be developed, not being accorded the opportunity to show what they can do. So, you know, I am, you will not be surprised to hear, not impressed by those arguments. I'm especially not impressed by them when you're talking about getting rid of test scores for kids trying to get into colleges so as not to see the consequences of their lack of development. I'm especially unimpressed by that position when you're talking about violent criminal behavior affecting the lives of millions of people, for which people make excuses by saying, oh, it's because there's racism in society, not because we failed to raise our children. So yeah, I'm going to go all the way down with the social capital kind of framework in the face of this, what I think is, you know, a distraction from the challenge that confronts us. I mean, yes, history casts a long shadow, and you could make the argument plausibly as a sociologist, as a historical sociologist, that much of the behavioral pathology that I've called attention to has roots in American history. But if you don't develop your children, if you don't get control over the culture that is corrupting the souls of so many people and leading them to waste their God-given potential, you can be petitioning white people until the cows come home with your DEI argument, and you won't have moved the needle at all. So if that's a response to you, you know. Thank you.
Here. You mentioned out-of-wedlock birth rates. What can we do in this country to bring those down? If you look at our country in the 1960s, or in 1960 itself, when we were a much more racist country, out-of-wedlock birth rates amongst all four races, if you consider there to be four races, were all under 10%. Now I believe in the Asian community it's still very low. In the white community it's about 40%. In the Hispanic community it's about 50%. In the black community it's almost 3/4. It seems to me that's the biggest driver of different outcomes in our society. If we can fix that, a lot of good things will flow through. How do we fix that?
I mean, you know, let me not pretend. I mean, there are people in this room, Brad Wilcox is in here somewhere, people who work on this stuff every day, and they know more about it than I do, but I very seriously doubt that Brad Wilcox has got an answer to that question. I mean, you know, there's some things that you can do. You can get the incentives right so that you don't encourage people to have children out of wedlock based on your transfer programs and your tax policy and so on. You can do that. You can try to get the culture right. God help you. I mean, by changing the messages that we send out from our various quarters, you know, the entertainment industry, movies and television and so forth, political leaders and so forth. You can encourage a Christian revival, or, okay, you don't like Christian, make it a Muslim revival. I'm actually not all that concerned about whether or not it's a Christian or a Muslim revival. I'm talking about a return to foundational questions about what are our responsibilities before God to ourselves, our children, and our progeny, and so on. But what's the right metaphor here? You're right. The facts that you stated are absolutely correct. 60 years ago, we were talking single digits or low teens. Now we're talking half the population. You can pull on a string and unravel the fabric, but pushing on that string is not going to reweave the fabric that you've just unraveled. I don't know how to undo modernity, which it seems to me is what we're talking about. I could go down the list of nouveau innovations to our domestic understanding of how we relate to each other about sexuality and so forth, but I've already gotten myself in enough trouble with what I've said here that I'll stop. So I'm sorry not to be a fount of wisdom on the question of how do you undo a half century of cultural devolution, but I don't know the answer.
One of the major problems with, my name is Bob Turner, one of the major problems with affirmative action is it makes racism logical. If I needed serious heart or brain surgery and I was told all you can know about the 3 candidate doctors are one is Asian, one is white, and one is black, I would immediately rule out the black, not because I'm a racist, but because I know from my experience teaching at UVA for more than 3 decades, that we admit black students who are not competitive, and then we pass them through. And thus, I would say there is a greater risk that my black doctor is going to be incompetent, and I'm going to die as a result. Thomas Jefferson was a redhead. If UVA started a policy of admitting redheads with C+ averages, pretty soon, the other students, black and white, would start concluding, you know, redheads aren't really as bright as other people. In my 32+ years of teaching at UVA in the law school, I also taught in what's now the politics department, which was different. But in the law school, I gave 1 A+. And that was to a woman from Oakland, California, who from her appearance didn't have a drop of white blood in her. What she did have was 2 parents who loved her enough to push her from the time she was a child. And I talked to a friend in the dining hall, and he said, oh, she's setting a curve in my class as well. Yet she's out there now practicing law, and there's an invisible asterisk in the corner of her diploma that says, oh, wait a minute, she's black. Yeah, she went to UVA, but you can't really assume she'll be as good as most of the UVA students. And she is a victim of affirmative action. One of my classmates, when I got my first law degree at UVA, was Goody, or I shouldn't say that, he gets mad at me, was Thurgood Marshall Jr. He was a good friend. We practiced moot court together, and he was absolutely brilliant. And he grew up with the Kennedys for his dinner companions at home. He had every opportunity, and the idea that he should have been given admission preference over some white kid whose father died in a coal mine cave-in and who studied by the light of a candle is outrageous. You know, what we ought to be doing is seeking a society in which color is about as relevant as height, hair color, hairstyle, what have you, and not making race the central focus of our society. And until we do that, we're going to be encouraging racism. I assume the Supreme Court is going to strike down the affirmative action system, and I hope when it happens, there will be black and other scholars pointing out to blacks that this is a great boon to you in the long run, because right now you are suffering from a very logical prejudice that has resulted from a racist admission process. What do you think?
That wasn't exactly a question, but it's okay.
At the end, I said, what did you think? So that.
No, okay, what do I think? Well, I mean, I intimated what I thought in my closing remark where I said, you know, equality is something you have to earn. I have an essay out there called Affirmative Distraction, which says about affirmative action that, okay, so we've got an issue, which is that we have this racial disparity in the development of our young people that is reflected in their performance on these academic instruments like tests, and that leads to the use of affirmative action as a way to balance the numbers. And if that's where you're gonna, I mean, I can understand how in 1970 somebody might have said we need to do something, you know, we're in the midst of a civil rights upheaval, we need to kind of, you know, diversify where you didn't have many blacks on campus and stuff like that. As a transitory measure responding to a kind of state of emergency situation, you're making a state of exception. You're taking yourself outside of what you want to have as your normal framework in a transitory way. I can understand people making that argument, but that's a long time ago. We're a half century down the road on this. So it's affirmative distraction because the real problem is developing your people's capacities to perform, the evidence of the need for which is represented in the fact that they're scoring low on these ability tests. And by the way, the score on these ability tests correlates with the performance of the students after they are admitted to the institution. So what you're doing is you're knowingly creating an institution where by race there will be discernible differences in the performance of the students after they are admitted. Now, you can do a couple of things with that. You can either own up to that, in which case you kind of humiliate and make into a kind of remedial charges the black students of you admitted with lower scores, or you can cover it up, like they do at the Georgetown Law Center, where when a lecturer in a negotiations course, her name happened to be Sandra Sellers, is caught on an open mic saying to a colleague, I regret it, but you know, year after year, the kids who are clustering at the bottom of my class are black, and what can we do about that? But they know that they're admitting these kids with lower LSAT scores and less impressive academic profiles, and they know that those things correlate with how kids do after they admit. Otherwise, they wouldn't be using them to sort the white kids that they're admitting to the program. So it's a predictable consequence of the use of affirmative action that you're going to get this lower performance, and yet people build that in and then want to lie about it. I mean, for Sandra Sellers, they called her a racist. She was fired by the dean. There was a big brouhaha at the Georgetown Law Center about the fact that somebody had acknowledged what was actually true. Similar things could be said about the notorious Amy Wax, who acknowledged in public that in her experience at UPenn Law, black kids were clustering at the bottom of her classes. Well, that was either true or false. My guess is that it's true because no one has presented evidence to the contrary, and it's a predictable consequence of the program. Okay, so here's the first thing I want to say. Don't patronize me. I'm a human being here. I can take it. Your performance was not quite up to snuff. We're not going to put you on the A line. We're going to put you on the B line because that's where you are right now. Keep at it. I can take that. Don't patronize me. I'm not a child. Don't treat me like a child. Don't treat me like a ward. Don't treat my son and my daughter like a ward. They grew up at the top of American society because their father has a PhD from MIT. If I didn't do my job or they didn't do theirs, then you should tell us exactly that. The presumption that because of my race, I'm entitled to a dispensation that excuses me from the requirements that everybody else is required to make is terrible. This is not equality. This is patronization. This is treating people like they're children. So Justice Thomas is famous in his memoir, My Grandfather's Son, and elsewhere for having said about his Yale law degree that it was as if he, had, it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on because people would presume that he wasn't up to snuff. This is one of the greatest Americans of African descent in the history of this country. I'm talking about the longest serving sitting justice on the United States Supreme Court. He deserved better than what he got when so many, liberals wrote him off as a mediocrity and a stooge of the late Justice Scalia, when in fact, you don't have to bias jurisprudence. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know where you stand on originalism and all of that kind of stuff. But this is a great man. So he didn't deserve the asterisk, and neither do I.
Okay.
Acts like you speaking, are people speaking out against this? And what do you get called? What names do you get called?
Oh, please, let's not.
But
Uncle Tom, Coon, Step and Fetch It, whatever. And I used to spend my time, oh, woe is me, woe is me. I don't have that much time. I'm 74 years old, so I don't, I'm not going to worry about what they call me.
So
Okay, time for a couple more questions. Anybody?
this is not a racial question. It's an academic question. Give you 3 quick examples. I live in Baltimore, and this is a true stat. It sounds unbelievable. Not one kid in the Baltimore city schools, which are about 75% black, not one kid graduated who could meet the minimum federal English or math scores. Not one. You go to UVA, we've done away with SATs. President Ryan would say, gee, that's because of COVID. It's because he wants 55,000 applicants. Well, duh, you can fog a mirror and apply because you didn't have an SAT. Our former provost, thank God she's gone, is now president of Penn. They did away with SATs. It was announced yesterday they're doing away with the dean's list. I don't get this. What is wrong with teachers K through 12 and professors? What's the end game? You're not preparing your kids for the challenge of life. I mean, this is not a racial question, it's an academic question. What do professors think they're accomplishing with this? You go in the real world, if you don't meet your sales budget, you're fired. This is the world I lived in. What do they think they're training these kids for? I really don't understand the end game.
Well, I can't speak for them. I can tell you that the consequence of what they're doing is destroying these institutions of merit and of excellence. So I didn't know that about Penn. And K through 12, I'm sorry, I'm going to preach. I mean, it's going to be like, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, so I don't feel entirely justified in it. But let my people go. Let these kids go. Let these kids and their families seek the provision of educational services from whatever source they think is best for their families. They don't belong to the unions. These kids do not belong to the unions. The unions work for us. So if the Democratic politicians, again, I'm sorry for the way that this sounds because it's partisan, but that's the reality. The reality is that Democratic politicians are standing between so many of our children and their opportunity to get a decent purchase on life. That's scandalous.
When's the reckoning? What causes the reckoning?
Well, China. I mean, the world is not going to stand still for this nonsense. You're going to look up and you're going to be a third world country. Excuse me if I offend anybody. You're going to be a second-rate former country. You're not going to have any scientists. You're not going to be able to fix anything or make anything worth anything. Mediocrity. That's you. I mean, I don't know how you do a physics curriculum without an SAT test. You're going to have these STEM departments defending themselves from mediocre students by foisting their own entry requirements. You can't major in physics or mathematics unless you pass my test. The president won't let you take the SAT test, but you're going to have to take my test before I let you get into my classroom because there is no substitute for knowing differential and integral calculus if you want to do a technical subject. And those subjects are hard.
When are you going to run for president?
You flatter me. Thank you.
Okay, one last question.
Slavery goes back to the earliest human days. Probably not the hunter-gatherer, but when the farmers started settling down, some subjected others, and it's part of history. I got very interested in Roman history and reading about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. Really, there's nothing about race that's a particular issue. And I was recently in Richmond at the wonderful art museum there. There's Septimius Severus, who was one of the better Roman emperors. He was black. And I understand there was never any concern whatsoever about his color or race. It never entered into the thing. Now, the Romans had slaves. Every culture has had slaves. But I'm wondering why race has become such a huge issue. I mean, it dominates everything in this country, and it's a poison. And you're just great. Thank you for coming. I don't know if I have a question there, but I was interested in this. Why slavery is such an issue. 50 million slaves in the world today, and nobody talks about it. What about all the worry about, why don't we get out there, particularly in Sudan and Asia and in various parts of the world. It's existent today. Let's worry about that. our history, I'm proud of what our country has done. With 600,000 lives lost in the Civil War would end that, and I think we've done the best that any country can do. I just can't thank you enough for coming and speaking as you have tonight.
Thank you. I just want to say this. I mean, I appreciate the statement, and I agree with it. Why are we looking back to the 19th and the 18th century and not looking forward to the 21st century? And I fear that the answer to that question is because we advocates on behalf of progressive racial justice are, how did the guy put it in that movie? I'm sorry, I'm blocking on the actor's name now. You can't stand the truth. Jack Nicholson, yeah. You can't handle the truth. The 21st century is hard, and it's man up and woman up time. And if you got an audience, and by the way, you white people, don't give them an audience. If you got an audience, let's talk about the 19th century. Let's do the 1619 Project. Let's do slavery. Let's do American history through the lens of oppression and domination, because that is a much more comforting way of confronting the problem than actually manning up and womaning up. So I think it's the failures of the 21st century that ultimately explain why people want to spend so much time in the 19th century.
Bravo. Glenn, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Thank you, guys.